The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're so pleased to have Delegate Ken Plum with us today. Welcome, sir.
Woody, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Telecommunications Association for allowing us to talk to our constituents, VTV.
Great. And I believe you represent the 36th District in Northern Virginia, and I think you've been here about 36 years.
It turns out that's the case. I have on my 36th year, and the 36th District is essentially the Reston community. I have a couple precincts on the Herndon side of Reston and a couple precincts on the Vienna side, but otherwise Reston's about 90% of my district.
So the business of the General Assembly proceeds, and I understand you just came from a press conference with Governor McAuliffe about I-66.
Yeah, hot topic back home. Northern Virginia is a prosperous community, one of the most prosperous in the nation. It also, as a cost of that prosperity, has some of the worst congestion, highway congestion. And when you look at where that congestion occurs, nothing like the bottleneck that occurs on I-66 every morning and every evening as people traverse that area to get into western Fairfax and Loudoun County. I've been really pleased with the way the governor has approached not only this issue, but the General Assembly in general. He has looked for ways to resolve issues, and he had a plan on the table that would have expanded I-66 outside the Beltway, and after a period of study would look at expanding I-66 inside the Beltway. I'm pleased to say that as of today, he has announced that they're going to go forward with the expansion of I-66 inside the Beltway. That is to say, we're going to widen the road. That has been controversial with people, but only one needs to sit in the traffic there for the many minutes it takes to get through from my district, for example, out the Dulles access road, the toll road, onto the interconnector road to I-66, to realize how much that's a bottleneck, not only for people getting home to their children and their families and so on, it's a bottleneck for commerce, for business and so on in the district. So we're going to go forward with an expansion plan. We're going to add a couple lanes, east and west, inside the Beltway, all the way from the connection with the Dulles Toll Road to then I-66 and through Arlington. That will give some immediate relief. Outside the Beltway, there was always a plan to make an expansion, and that will go forward. Part of the controversy about all this, of course, is it has a price tag. And the price tag results in how do you raise the money. The governor's plan proposed to use tolls, and that's a pretty common way in which roads are built these days. People in my district are certainly familiar with tolls. We've had the Dulles Toll Road for more than 25 years, and I was part of putting the Dulles Toll Road enabling legislation on the books. What it allowed us to do was to have a interstate-like road that is the Dulles Toll Road in place probably 20 years earlier than it would have happened had we not used a tolling mechanism. What will happen now is that people who use I-66 during the commuting time, who now can use it during the commuting time with HOV, in other words, they have two people in their car, will continue to do that, and they'll continue to do it for free. What will change with the tolling will be that if you want to, as a single driver, use the I-66 during the commuting hours, you pay a toll. That's not unlike that we do it on the service lanes, the express lanes on the Beltway. On the Beltway now, if you're driving with 3 people in the car, you can go through the tolling mechanism without any charge. We've got this Easy Pass Express that allows you to do that. So the I-66 then will have the same method of saying to people, if you've been in a single car and not had access to I-66 inside the Beltway, you're now going to have that access because we're going to widen the road. And in order to pay for the widening, we're going to charge you a toll. That's expanded road brought about by expanded funds that are available through the tolling mechanism.
Now, is this going to be done by way of a public-private partnership?
Yeah, it's two steps. One, the inside the Beltway, which is essentially a widening operation that we want to get underway right away. That will be a VDOT project that will be contracted and built and under the management and so on of VDOT. Outside of the Beltway on I-66, we'll do the same process that we've done on I-95 and on I-395 and in other places throughout the state, is that we'll ask for proposals, and from those proposals we'll make a decision as to which one best meets the long-term interest of the state, and it probably will be some kind of partnership outside the Beltway. But in order to facilitate moving forward on this project, we're not going to do that inside the Beltway.
I see. Now, you sit on the Transportation Committee, and of course in 2013 there was a funding proposal that was adopted and passed into law. How has that worked in your opinion?
You know, it has worked well. I mean, we now have money to build projects. You know, we were grinding to a halt in terms of being able to take on new projects. Essentially what we were able to do prior to that passage of that bill was to maintain what we've got. And what we realized in many places, we don't have adequate capacity to carry the commuters. Again, it's a compliment on the one hand, the fact that the economy is growing and we're doing well. On the other hand, of course, it's something that we've got to respond to. What we did in that bill in 2013 is to create new funding mechanisms. One being the use of the internet taxation when it was passed by the federal government. Now that never happened, so we didn't get that money to spend. And the other thing we did is we shifted the taxation from gas from a per gallon amount to a percentage of the price of gas. And while we love the fact that gas went down, it affected our estimate a little bit in terms of the money we have. But beyond that bill in 2013, the other thing that we've done that is of major significance in road building in Virginia is that we've gone to a constrained plan for roads. We take now from all localities their proposals as to what they need by way of road improvement. And they are then put through by a third party a rigorous examination as to the likelihood they're going to relieve congestion, the necessity for economic development, all those various factors that you'd take into account in order to figure out which roads should get priority, are taken into account by a third party, and then we give it a score, so to speak. And that scoring then decides the roads that we have on the list. In the old days, you could have your road written into law, but there was no money to fund it. Now it only becomes part of the plan when there's funding and when it meets the criteria that relative to all the other projects in the state, it's a very important one. It rises to the top, if you will. And I might say to you that using that process, in any way you look at it, I-66 is the biggest bottleneck, the biggest problem area in the state, and it always rises to the top.
So that criteria is set forth in, I think, House Bill number 2. You talked about congestion mitigation, economic development, and there are other factors. And I guess, is it the Commonwealth Transportation Board that takes all of those factors into consideration and makes recommendations about funding?
Exactly. That process is, again, a very methodical one that is essentially outside of the legislature or outside of the political process, I guess I should say. And it allows then engineers, and traffic management people, and others to develop a criteria within the range that you've mentioned here to be able to come up with a score, so to speak. And the score is a relative one to all other projects. How significant is it that we move forward on that one? And based on that score, then, the Commonwealth Transportation Board makes its judgment as to how to allocate the funds. We really need to have the Commonwealth Transportation Board an appointed board that's not elected, that's outside of the political process, to try to make as an objective a decision as they can. And frankly, I think they do a really good job of doing that. We don't always get all of our projects funded, but there's not enough money to go around. So picking and choosing, it can't be who gets the most votes to get into the legislature. It has to be the science behind how important is this road relative to other road projects.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say that. But the good news is, having applied that new process now, the governor, in agreement with the Republican majority, has agreed that I-66 inside the Beltway is of such significance and such importance that we have to move forward on its widening. And I will tell you that this issue has been debated for as long as I've been here. It's been debated as long as 66 has been open, whether or not the road ought to be widened and whether or not there ought to be mass transit options. I need to say to you that while we're talking about the widening, we haven't given up on the mass transit options. You know, the Orange Line runs right down the middle of I-66 and all the way to the town of Vienna. On those same tracks from Roslyn out to West, past East Falls Church, the Silver Line runs on that same track. And then it runs on out to Reston, to my community, and will open in 2020 all the way to Loudoun County through the Dulles Airport and so on. So that significant major mass transit project is underway. Secondly, as part of this overall I-66 plan, there's always been a multimodal approach to it. And that means that there has been an enhanced bus system plan so that people can come to the metro station, not in a car, but come by bus. Get on the train. And I might say that sometimes people talk about riding the metro in relation to getting to the District of Columbia. Well, I live in Reston. I can walk to the metro in about 25 minutes. I ride the metro to Tyson's Corner. I ride the metro to Arlington. I ride the metro to downtown when I need to. But the thing being is it also runs both ways. When you ride the metro from west to east, I'm always astonished to see then how many trains are coming into our community. Our service workers, for example, and a lot of people who support the growth of our community are coming into our community also on metro. So it is a comprehensive plan. I focused today on the widening because that's new, that's fresh, but the multimodal plan is still in place and it's still going to be followed through with.
And of course, on a statewide basis, rail is very important to the Commonwealth for commercial reasons and also for moving passengers as well.
My wife and I have kind of developed a plan that we go to Europe every summer, and I'm blessed that we're able to do that. We use public transit. I mean, we see what Europe's been able to do with rail transit, and it's really quite a shame that we gave up on rail too quickly in our country because it has enormous advantages. A well-developed, well-planned, on-time system of rail works in other places in the world, and it can work here. And I am a big proponent of the notion that we increase our support for rail among our major cities and so on in the Commonwealth. It again would be a big boost to our economic development to be able to have that option available to people.
It's very important to the Port of Virginia, for example.
Oh my gosh, you know, when you look at the gateway to the United States, when you look at the gateway to our country, you can list the Port of Virginia, which is of course a critically important port, the deepest around. Its flexibility in being able to handle cargo and so on is limited only by how we get this rail or an enhanced rail to get the containers out of there. And then of course on my side of the place, it's also Dulles Airport and its growth and enhancement.
So you've been a leader in education for years. You are a retired educator of 30 years plus.
Yeah.
There's always a debate about the need or necessity for charter schools in the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
I think we have, 9 charter schools now. There's a move by way of a constitutional amendment to take the authority away from the local school districts and place it in the State Board of Education. Where are we on that issue?
Well, the bill is passing through the legislature, and I will tell you that I've been opposed to it from the very beginning. If it passes the legislature, it'll go on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, and people this November will decide. Some say we only, as you have indicated, we only have 9 charter schools in Virginia, so that's an issue. And I would suggest to you that the fact we only have 9 charter schools proves my point that Virginia school districts have been very responsive to responding to the needs of individual and collective groups of students. In my district, for example, there are a number of special programs, centers, magnet schools, special schools, and so on, that accommodate the needs and interests of a wide range of children. That's public school choice within the public arena. The ability to take public money outside the school governance framework and have it spent in a charter school, which is a private school, not supervised by local government. And under this constitutional amendment thing, local government, well, I guess we'll get a look-see that it's coming to town, but otherwise it's set up by a state authority.
Right.
That violates the whole constitutional framework which we have for public education in Virginia. This framework that we have established, and Virginia is unique among the schools in that in 1971, when we amended our Constitution, we put education into the Constitution as a constitutional right. And we recognize that it's a partnership between state and local government. The best ideal situation is that the state would put about half the money in, the localities would put about half the money in, and that's varied over time as resources are available. But the point being is we're both in this. The State Department of Education and State Board of Education sets standards and so on, but the operation of schools has been a local function. And these days, it's a function of an elected school board. So if people have some quarrel or some concern about how their schools are run, they need only go to their elected school board member and express those. I personally, as an educator, found the Schuylkill School Board to be very responsive. The Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology is one of the most famous schools and possibly one of the best schools in the United States of America. It is a public school operated by Fairfax County Public Schools, conceived and set up that way. Didn't need to go outside the framework of the school board. There are other, Mountain View School is not as well known, but for children who don't make it through the regular secondary school because of economic issues, social issues, or whatever the problems may be that interfere with their education, they can come back and finish at Mountain View School. It's not a charter school, it's a public school. So what I'm saying is and I've tried to say to the legislature is, it's true we only have 9 charter schools because 9's probably as many as we need. In fact, it may be 9 more than we really need if we were to allow our local school divisions under our elected school boards to spend our public money in a public school.
So how has the funding formula worked in terms of the higher cost that Northern Virginia has? It's called the Local Composite Index, I believe.
Oh yeah. The theory behind all this, of course, is that as a constitutional guarantee, not just on our state constitution, but the courts have interpreted that the Equal Protection Clause of the federal constitution applies to schools as well. You've got to give all children an equal access to a quality education. Your quality of education can't be dependent upon where your mom and dad decided to buy a house or build a house or whatever. It's dependent upon the local's governance structure to make sure you have a quality program. And so what we have is a situation where some communities are very wealthy. That's true of Northern Virginia, Southside Virginia and so on, very poor communities. The Local Composite Index tries to measure the ability of each of those localities to support their own schools. That Local Composite Index, which is more complicated than we want to get into here, that measures that ability to raise money, is applied. And so in my jurisdiction, the jurisdictions put about 75% of the money in for the schools, and the state puts 25% in. Go to the poor school divisions in the state and you'll find that the local puts in 25%, the state puts in 75%. That's to try to give everybody a level playing field. Now some argue that it doesn't work as well as it might, and that discussion will continue. We periodically go back and revise it. The difficulty in revising it is that given the pot of money being the same, if you're going to give somebody more, you give somebody less. That's never a popular approach. One of the things that's been particularly difficult for Northern Virginia is that not only are we a wealthy area of the state in terms of the value of the property and people's income, it's also a costly place to do business. That's reflected in the community generally. So when the school funding formula is applied, there's no way that cost of living is measured in the Local Composite Index. And so what we've done over the years is to add a cost to compete factor to allow, for example, us to pay our teachers a little more because our teachers have to live in the community and they have to pay the higher rents and the higher real estate costs. That composite index has been eroded, or that cost to compete factor has been eroded over the years to where now it's less effective than it might be. The good news this year is that we are slowly but surely coming back from the 2008 recession. We are now to the point of where we have some money to allocate, some money to spend. Overall, for all the schools in the state, we need to put a major infusion of money into the system. Governor McAuliffe recognized that, and he made it his #1 budget priority. He's putting about $1 billion new in education generally. That's money well spent. We think also what should happen is that we ought to revisit the composite index and also, again, the cost to compete part of the composite index, and make sure that we have enough of a factor in there to make our school system competitive. I might say that this cost to compete factor is not unique to schools. Police officers, state police officers, for example, who get stationed in Northern Virginia, get a little more in their paycheck because they have to pay a little more rent. And social work and some of the other categories of state employees who are stationed in Northern Virginia get that additional money so that they can afford to live there, if you will.
Now, the second year of the governor's budget calls for a raise for teachers and state employees in general. To what extent does that increase the local burden because of the match, especially for teachers?
Yeah. Well, the best case situation, of course, is that we would appropriate some money and we'd send it off to the school divisions, but that's not that simple. What happens when we appropriate the money, this local composite index is applied. So that when you apply the local composite index, it decides that if you're going to give a teacher a $1 raise, when you apply the local composite index in my division, for example, it means that the state's going to give you about a quarter of that $1 and you have to come up with the rest. So we absolutely have to give teachers raises. In our school division, which attempts to, again, be as responsive as it can be to schools, and I'm not meaning to be critical of them, it's simply because the school system is growing up there. Over the last several years, we're getting 2,500 new students every year, in a year, and that adds the cost up. But when we need to recognize in giving them a raise that in the state, we need to do a little better than the composite index to be able to help divisions do that. You see, it's the case that under the Dillon rule, a locality can only raise money that the state gives them the authority to raise that money. So a local government, in the case of a county, is pretty much limited to things like the real property tax. And people know about the real property tax because what they've seen up in our area has been that while the rate is about the same, the value of their property continues to increase. And when the value of their property continues to increase, some older folks end up paying as much in property tax or more than they pay on their mortgage. That's a bit out of kilter. So again, all these factors together, the point being is that the governor said it's most important. His budget reflects that. We're going to go forward with that, and that's going to be good news for our schools. Is it going to be as good news as we had hoped? I think we continue to need to work in Fairfax to look at whether or not we can get state authority. For example, not involved, but a very popular idea is the meals tax. Cities, for example, have meals tax all over the place. Unpopular with some of the people in the commercial interest in Northern Virginia, but I would submit that the pennies that you pay on a meal by eating out, we're not talking about groceries, we're talking about eating out kind of meals, that would give a real boost to the ability to fund our schools.
Another issue that's been highlighted so far this session deals with gun violence. I think it was significantly enhanced, at least in terms of media coverage, by the Attorney General's decision to no longer recognize reciprocity for concealed carry permits with states that don't meet the Commonwealth standards. Apparently there's a compromise on that, but I know you've been involved in those issues for a long time.
Woody, it's out of hand. The amount of gun violence that's occurring in our country, we've seen instances in Virginia with Virginia Tech. You know, that's a world record-setting mass murder by an individual. We don't want that kind of reputation. We've seen people shot to death while they're on television in Virginia. The gun violence thing, we have to move forward trying to do all we can to prevent that. I, for example, introduced a bill that would have expanded background checks at gun shows. The majority chose not to go forward with that. The governor, to his credit, recognizing that the people who are the supporters, if you will, of the gun laws as they are now, were very upset with the Attorney General's finding. I congratulate the Attorney General because what he did is what he is sworn to do, and that's to uphold the law. And the law said that we recognize the concealed weapon permits of states that have standards equal or greater than our standards. There were 25 states that didn't do that. So he simply said, we're not going to recognize their permits. That's what the legislature told him to do. People got very upset. They didn't choose it. didn't like that idea. So the NRA, the National Rifle Association, came forth with a proposal that if you will take that back, what he had done in terms of, we'll go forward on a couple of bills. What we are proposing now to take back is the notion that the Attorney General, or that Virginia will recognize everybody's concealed weapon permit. I don't like that idea. I'm not going to vote for that bill. It's a bill that is a pig in a poke. It says that somebody in North Dakota or Wyoming or whatever the other state might be, can simply hand out concealed weapon permits, which some states do. And some states are now debating to allow people to carry concealed weapons without a permit. I don't want to subject the safety of our people in Virginia to that kind of arbitrariness. So I'm not voting for that bill. I am voting for what the governor was able to extract by way of concession, if you will, from the NRA people, and that is that we would take guns away from people if a permanent protective order had been issued against them. I would like to see that bill be stronger. We do things incrementally around here, so I'll vote for the bill. But I would tell you that in future years I will join others in coming back and saying that that same prohibition on having a gun would apply to emergency and to temporary restraining orders, because that's when the emotions are the highest. There are too many stories of someone who, in a passionate moment between spouses or among lovers or whatever, where the gun is a response to an emergency order, and I think we need to strengthen that. But we'll make a little step forward on that. But he also agreed with them to have a voluntary universal background check at gun shows. That's not anywhere close to what my bill would have done. I will accept it as a little step forward. What it will do is it will ensure that there's a state trooper at all the gun shows. And if you voluntarily want to have a background check, if you're selling a gun or if you're buying a gun, they'll run the background check for you. Last year, where only licensed gun dealers do these checks, we intercepted like 260 some people. And I think we can't leave it to voluntary action. It needs to be the law of the land for everybody.
Great.
I'll take that step forward and we'll build it in the future time.
Great. Thank you for being here, Delegate Ken Plum. Good
My
to
pleasure.
see you again.
Glad to see you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.